Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the Path to Liberty. This is the Fast Friday edition of the show for September 6th, 2019. Now, if you're like me, you've probably heard people say that the Constitution is a total failure. You know, look all around us. You can see how big the government is, how many times it violates people's rights. It doesn't stay within its limits. So obviously, the story goes the Constitution doesn't work, or it's actually the thing that caused the problems that we face today. So I'm going to talk about that. But first of all, my name is Michael Bolden. We broadcast live every single Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 9:30 a.m. Pacific time from here in my home office and studio in downtown Los Angeles for the 10th Amendment Center. You can find all of the platforms, both video and podcast edition, our archives, show notes, links to stuff that I reference in the episodes over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. I'm really grateful that you decided to spend a little time with me today. And just to make sure that it's not too much of your time, and since it's the Fast Friday edition of the show, I'm going to try to get this done in about 10 to 15 minutes. Let's see what we can do. First of all, this is from an article that we published by Mike Meharry back in June of 2016, but I think it's pretty timeless. He starts out with this quote we often hear, starting out from Lysander Spooner. He's a 19th century anarchist who I think a lot of people have read at least a little bit. Generally, they don't go past this quote, and that's the end of the story. And he puts it this way: but whether the Constitution really be one thing or another, this much is certain, that it is either authorized such a government as we have had, or has been powerless to prevent it. In either case, it is unfit to exist. And so then, as the story goes, oh yeah, that makes logical sense. You know, it sounds pretty logical to me, and I think that Spooner had done quite a bit of really good writing, so he's got a good reputation for people who believe in liberty. And so hearing that, that's like the big ta-da. And so oftentimes we'll see, anytime we post about something about the Constitution, we'll have some righteous indignation, and someone will comment and just say, see Spooner, checkmate, or they'll leave this particular comment suggesting that, of course, the Constitution is worthless. What's the point of even talking about it? But Mike puts it this way. He says, I find a very odd assumption buried in this line of thinking. This idea that the Constitution can or should somehow enforce itself. I would take it even further. It's suggesting that words on paper can either do something, not do something, create something, prevent something, and the like. And Mike says it like this. He says, you can't just wave the document in front of an out-of-control government or in front of the officials or agencies like a red cloth in front of a bull and expect them to simply stop what they're doing. Without some enforcement mechanism, the Constitution is of little use when it comes to limiting the power of the federal government. It, in and of itself, a document, holding up a document and saying, you've got to read this, doesn't get them to do anything. And that's another thing we often hear from people, like when we educate on things like the Commerce Clause or the General Welfare Clause. We'll hear from people, oh, you should tell the president or you should tell the members of Congress that they need to read this. But literally, like Mike says, just waving a document with words on it in front of politicians that really want to continue the status quo, they like the power that they have, isn't a very effective way of getting things done. And we know that this is how it's always been. This is not some new revelation from me or from Meharry or from anybody else. This isn't brand new. This is what the so-called father of the Constitution had to say. That's James Madison back in the Federalist Papers. He talked about this pretty much in depth in Federalist 48. He described limits on power in constitutions as mere parchment barriers. Now, Madison wasn't the only one that used the phrase parchment barriers, but he's the most famous to have done this. And the point in this is that this is just a piece of paper. It may have great ideas, and this comes from the guy credited with being the father of the Constitution. I don't think that's an actual correct term for him, but if he's saying this from the outset, then why does anyone else expect it to be more than a parchment barrier? And he put it this way in Federalist 48, will it be sufficient to mark with precision the boundaries of these departments in the constitution of the government, and to trust these parchment barriers against the encroaching spirit of power? This is the security, Madison wrote, which appears to have been principally relied upon by the compilers of most of the American constitutions, the state constitutions. But experience assures us that the efficacy of the provision has been greatly overrated, and that some more adequate defense is indispensably necessary for the more feeble against the more powerful members of the government. And the short version is, government does not stick to the limits of power that has been delegated to it or written down just because they've been written out or put on a document. Government cannot be trusted. It is in the nature of government to always expand. Dave Benner wrote about this as well in another article, Parchment Barriers Not Enough to Stop Tyranny. And he goes through that basic same summary, pointing out what Madison had to say in Federalist 48, but also St. George Tucker. He was the most important legal mind of his time. In Commentaries of the Constitution, he put it this way: all governments have a natural tendency towards an increase and assumption of power. And the administration of the federal government has too frequently demonstrated that the people of America are not exempt from this vice in their constitution. This is what governments do, is what we're told. We should all know this by now. Government always wants to expand. And he goes on, Tucker says, we have seen that I believe this was 1803 when Tucker wrote this. We have seen that parchment chains are not sufficient to correct this unhappy propensity. They're good to have, but if you are relying on a constitution to enforce itself, you're going to be pretty sad with the results. It's just not going to play out very well. And Madison went on further in Federalist 48 in that same document about some consequences of relying on these parchment barriers. He put it this way: the conclusion which I am warranted in drawing from these observations is that a mere demarcation on parchment of the constitutional limits of the several departments is not a sufficient guard against those encroachments which lead to a tyrannical concentration of all the powers of government in the same hands. So people who criticize our work in support of the Constitution, saying, well, the Constitution isn't going to do the job, are ignorant of the fact that the founders themselves, in fact, what many people consider to be the leading drafter of the Constitution, tells us don't rely on it, don't count on it, don't expect it. You put down rules. I mean, if you run a business and you have a bunch of rules on paper and your employees don't follow those rules, you don't blame the paper that you wrote it on. You don't blame the words. Maybe you had bad rules that are hard to enforce, but if you don't do the enforcement, it's your fault in the first place. And Dave Benner takes that a little further. Basically the same approach. He says it this way: all written contracts, whether constitutions or not, are impotent in their ability to bind authorities without some form of enforcement mechanism. Contracts inevitably lose their intrinsic force when they lack teeth. Even still, he writes, some of the same individuals that oppose constitutional government have also taken this argument to another level by suggesting that the same document that is powerless to prevent tyranny is somehow magical enough to establish and encourage a treacherous Leviathan government that knows no bounds. Now, that is exactly what we live under. We have a treacherous Leviathan government that knows no bounds, the largest government in the history of the world, involved in all kinds of things it never should have been involved in the first place. It shouldn't be involved in now. It needs to stop. But waving a constitution in front of it isn't going to get it to stop. And the Constitution itself doesn't make that happen. People who allow it to happen are the ones that are responsible. If you watched V for Vendetta, there was that great scene where V is saying, if you want to know who's responsible, just look in a mirror. Now, you and I didn't cause everything that's happening today, but the people have basically turned a blind eye over and over and over to violations of the Constitution because they're afraid. They wanted emergency powers. They were afraid of foreign threats. Madison warned us that foreign threats, real or pretended, would always be the way that they take liberties at home. We were warned. We should know this. And sooner or later, if you turn a blind eye or you support violations of the Constitution, no matter how small, sooner or later, the limits have no meaning. And that's where I believe we are today. And Meharry sums it up like this, and I think this is absolutely correct. Spooner was right in a sense, Mike writes. The Constitution was indeed powerless to stop the federal government from turning into an all-powerful monster. Of course, because a document is going to get run over by a government whose natural tendency is to increase and to attack liberty. That's what governments do. He says, but don't blame the Constitution. It's only ink and parchment. The blame for any constitutional failure falls squarely on our shoulders. I think the short version of blaming the Constitution for what we have today is just the fact that constitutions do not enforce themselves, and governments never limit their own power. Well, I hope you found this interesting, educational, and fun to watch. I really appreciate you spending some time with me today on this Fast Friday edition of the show for September 6th. If you support the work that we're doing here, to make sure to smash the like, subscribe, get bell notifications, and leave comments, whether it's live or in the archive, if you're on the video version, whatever platform you're on. And if you're listening on iTunes, leaving a review really helps us spread the word. I appreciate all the positive reviews that have been coming in on iTunes, so thank you very much. And if you want to support us financially, it's 10thamendmentcenter.com/members, where you can pitch in as little as $2 a month, and that makes a big difference here. We make it go a long, long way. Anyways, I really appreciate you spending some time with me. I'm very grateful that you're interested in listening to what I have to say. And I hope you have an awesome weekend. We'll see you here next week, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday on the path to liberty.